inviting me and organizing everything so perfectly. So what I thought I would do today, before getting to the novel, The Golden Gate, is to tell you all a little bit about my own personal and professional journey. Basically how I went from an incredibly shy East Asian kid to a Yale law professor and author of some conversation-starting books, and now a first-time novelist. And I was thinking about this, and at one level, the answer to how did this happen to me, at one level, the answer is by learning, sort of the hard way over years, to turn being an outsider, which I've always felt, even today at Yale, as an outsider, how to turn that from a disadvantage into a source of strength. And I was recently thinking that every single one of my books, including my foreign policy books, to the notorious Tiger Mom memoir, and now this novel, all in some ways reflect, and I think benefit from, an outsider perspective. So that's one answer. But the other answer, how did I end up here, and I think this is the more honest answer, is, I'm not kidding, through a series of total disasters and mistakes and the most humiliating rejections that at the time I thought I would never survive. I am the firmest believer in what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I'm always telling my daughters and my students that I really do believe everything has a silver lining. And that what often feels like the worst thing ever, that you can't even survive another day, always down the road turns out to be the best thing ever. It just sometimes takes a while. So starting at the beginning, my family is originally from the Fujian province of China. My great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was the chief military advisor and chief astrologist to the last Ming emperor. And my grandparents' generation left the Fujian province for the Philippines in the early 1900s, and they became part of this tiny Chinese minority there in the Philippines. Philippine watch out, and that relates later to the books that I'll be writing. So funny story, my grandmother, even though as a woman she was not allowed to work, the family business was all run by the men. She was actually the entrepreneurial one. She was the business genius. So after the Second World War, so my family's business was to produce fish paste, like anchovies. And they would always make the containers for them. But after the Second World War, my grandmother said, let's forget about the fish paste and just make the containers. And they became the largest plastics conglomerate in the Philippines. And that was all my grandmother, I'm sorry. But we never saw any of that because my father was the middle child and the black sheep of the family. He hated business. He didn't want to be part of this family thing. So in 1960, he persuaded my mother to elope to the United States. It was his greatest dream. He was a brilliant student, and he eloped to MIT, just down the street. Both my parents came here. They had not a penny. When my parents first got to this country, they didn't know a single person here. And they were too poor. They were so poor, they couldn't afford to pay for heat their first 2 winters in Boston. And you know how cold it is in Boston. So that was my kind of background. And I'm the eldest of 4 daughters. We spent my first 7 years in the Midwest, West Lafayette, Indiana, and talk about being total outsiders. We were the ones with the funny hair, funny accent, funny clothes. It's hard now for people to imagine this, but in the 70s and 60s, there were no Chinese people in the Midwest. We were the only Asian family in the entire neighborhood, and I was the only Chinese kid in the entire school, except for my sister. And so we were really like creatures from outer space. We would bring Chinese food in thermoses to school, and everybody would stare at us. I just wanted a peanut butter jelly sandwich. But I was telling my students that, ironically, in some ways, it was actually easier to be a Chinese American back then. You would think that there would be strength in numbers, but sadly, it's almost the opposite. As Councilman Flynn mentioned, back then in the 60s and 70s, China was not seen as a foreign policy threat. Nobody was afraid of China. And Asians were not seen as taking up all the college spots. So everybody loved us. So I often, we can maybe discuss this more later. I know there's a presentation this afternoon. Anyway, we moved in when I was 8 to the San Francisco Bay Area. My dad became a professor at UC Berkeley, where my new novel is set. And my parents were extremely strict. They were the original type of parents. If you read Battle Hymn, my book, it's a little tongue-in-cheek. It's supposed to be a little funny. That system of parenting was applied to me straight with no humor. Very high expectations. I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of that. When I would come home with a 99 out of 100, my mom's question was, what happened to that 1 point? And we were not allowed to do a lot of fun socializing, so I was a huge bookworm. It's very fitting that we were talking about shu, all I did was, I remember walking to the El Cerrito Public Library every week about a mile, and walking back, my arms overloaded with books. And they were all mystery books, Agatha Christie mystery books. When my Western friends hear about my childhood, they feel so sorry for me. They assume, oh my God, you must have been miserable. But that was completely wrong. I had an incredibly happy childhood. And part of the reason is that there was another side to my father. Remember, he was the rebel. And some people are born to be Americans, and he was just born to be an American. He was strict, but he has this huge love of life. He wanted to try everything. So we went crabbing, camping, fishing, everything. He never got a son. In Chinese times we had 4 girls. So he treated me as his son. So you may not know this about me. I know how to chop wood. I know how to use a chainsaw. He and I built a cabin. I dug a whole swimming pool by myself. I did. And he's a very creative professor. He writes about chaos theory and memristor. And he always told me, my mother was very traditional. Keep your head down. The loudest duck gets shot. Just be in the middle. My father was always go for the maximum. Always go for the maximum. Be a singular point, he told me. That's a mathematical term. You should be a singular point. And he said, you know what? You should invent your own field. That way there's nobody jealous of you. There's no competition. Invent your whole field. When I was a junior in high school, he had a sabbatical leave. Most people, they go to one place and they spend, you spend a year in London. My father took us to three months in London, 3 months in Munich, Germany, and 3 months in Lausanne, Switzerland. He didn't care that we didn't speak any German. He just threw us into a German high school and then a French high school, and it was one of the best years of my life. Anyway, but people are complicated. My dad was a free spirit in many ways. My parents are both still alive. We're very close, and I'm very much like him. But when it came to college, applying to college, he reverted back to strict authoritarian. Everybody else is visiting campuses. He said, no, you don't need to do that because you are living at home and going to Berkeley, free tuition. And the one time I disobeyed him, just like he disobeyed his parents, I had heard about one school. Everybody was talking about it. And I applied to one school only. And I got into Harvard. And when I told my dad, he didn't know what it was at first. He was a science guy. But then he asked around and decided it was okay. And so I went to Harvard, and there it was so fun, just a couple miles away, my first taste of freedom. But it was also a complete shock because I'd gone to a very, very big public high school. Believe it or not, I had never heard of Andover, Exeter, I did not know what a boarding school was. And it was a little bit difficult at Harvard for this reason. As the oldest child, I just wanted to please my parents. I did everything they wanted me to do. I'm not even sure I knew what I wanted to do. But back then, they wanted me to be a doctor, MD, PhD. So unthinkingly, I majored in applied math and I went pre-med at Harvard, which was ridiculous because I'm terrible at math and I faint at the sight of blood. How could I be a doctor? I switched my major to economics, not because I had any interest in economics, but because I thought maybe I could persuade my parents that it's kind of like a science. I applied to law school only to not have to go to medical school. And I wasn't talented enough to go to B school. And when I got, now there are many, many Asian Americans at law school, and I'm very proud of that. I was the only Asian in my Harvard Law School section of 150. When I told my mother that I was accepted to Harvard Law School, she burst into tears. She came from a culture where they did not respect lawyers back then. Now at Harvard Law School, this is when things got a little tough for me. Law did not come naturally for me. And part of this is because of the values I was raised with, Confucian values. Growing up, I was always told to respect elders, listen to your teachers. And I just wanted to listen to everything the teacher said and memorize it and write it all down. And that worked well in high school and college, but law school was totally different. I would get called on, huge room, Miss Chua, this judicial opinion, do you agree or disagree with it? I would just have a huge blank in my head. No thoughts, right? And because I would just think, a judge wrote it must be right. And so I had a hard time the way that I was raised. My husband's Jewish, and at their dinner table they debated philosophy and foreign policy and, the meaning of life. And in my immigrant family, we had the TV on. My mom's a great cook, we stuffed ourselves and we went off and did homework. So it took a little bit of adjusting, but I will say in favor of Tiger parenting values, that there is a lot to be said with the values that my parents instilled in me. That is work ethic, perseverance, like not giving up. I mean, I've never been the best student, but I can outwork anyone. And through that, I did fine. So I then went to clerk for a judge in the DC Circuit. And the last day of clerking for this, the judge interviews her 3 clerks and gives them life advice. So she pulled me in there, and she said, so what do you want to do with your life now? And again, unthinkingly, I said, I want to be a professor. I had always said this because my father's a professor, but I had no idea how I was going to be a professor or what I was going to teach. And my judge straightened me out. She was she was old school mentor, as in not at all nice or nurturing. And she said to me, oh my God, a professor, you couldn't possibly do that. Well, what would you teach? You don't know anything. And she said, you need to go out there into the world for at least 3 years, preferably 5, and do anything. Learn something, public interest, private sector, government, anything. So I took her advice and I joined this Wall Street firm of Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen & Hamilton that specializes in international business transactions. And while I was there, I made a lot of friends, learned a lot. They still come guest lecture for me at Yale Law School. But the entire 3.5 years I was there, I had massive imposter syndrome. I wasn't good at it. I knew I wasn't good at it. I was bored. And I started to go through a real crisis. I was like, because I really couldn't talk to my parents about this, but what am I doing with my life? Why did I go to law school? And I tried to write my first novel at that point. It was going to be an intergenerational mother-daughter Chinese immigrant story. Unfortunately, at that point, I had not realized how important it is to have a plot. So missing that was a total fail. And I fell into a depression, like, what am I doing? I thought about applying to psych grad school, like, what am I gonna do? And then I got incredibly lucky. I found my little specialty almost totally by accident. So here's what happened. At this law firm, Cleary, we represented governments. That's what I liked about it. Most law firms, you represent investment banks or corporations or insurance companies, but at Cleary, we represented the government of Venezuela, government of Philippines, government of Russia, government of Indonesia. And I liked that because I was always interested in developing countries. So right when I was there, I was put on this big deal representing the Mexican government. And that deal was the privatization of Mexico's national telephone company. It's called Telmex. So it was state-owned at the time in the 90s, and nothing worked. The phones completely didn't work in Mexico. So they wanted to get private capital in there, and we actually sold 51% to Carlos Slim, turning him into the richest man in the world overnight. But the other half was this IPO, and we had to make a securities disclosure. So as the lowest person on the totem pole, I was given the not very impressive job of writing up the history of Mexico's economy for the appendix. And it was not important at all, but I loved it. It's like, oh my, that's what I should have majored in. I love history. And this novel is a historical thriller. So I got really into this project. I did all this research, and I discovered an amazing pattern. I discovered that for all of Mexico's 200-year history, the country kept oscillating back and forth, swinging back and forth between very pro-capitalist, pro-private sector, pro-foreign investment periods, and then it would swing to revolutionary, anti-American, anti-imperial, kind of nationalizing revolutionary periods, and then it'd swing back to pro-private capital, pro-open, and then go back to xenophobic. So I wrote this whole thing up, and I remember giving it to this partner at this law firm. I thought, finally, I did a really good job on something. I'll never forget his reaction. He looked at this and he said, oh my God, this is awful. Do you not understand what we're trying to do? This is an IPO. We're trying to sell stock. And all this talk about anti-foreigner confiscation and xenophobia and nationalization. And he's like, this thing has to be 100% accurate, but it doesn't have to sound this bad. And then he said, besides, I asked for 3 paragraphs, not a dissertation. So I slunk off, failed again, and I gave him what he wanted. But then I had this 35-page document. And I decided, I've been out for about 3 years. Now maybe I can try to be a professor. So I turned this document into a draft article. I called it the Privatization Nationalization Cycle in Developing Countries. And I wrote a cover letter, and I decided to apply to law schools for teaching positions. I swear to God, I attached the cover letter with this draft article. I applied to 100 law schools across the country, including BU Law School, BC Law School, Fordham Law School. I got 100 rejections. 100. 8 of them after a full day of interviews, which really hurts, because that means they've met you, they interviewed you, and they don't like you. And one of the most humiliating places, the worst place I got rejected, was the Yale Law School. And the reason it was so bad was because my husband had just been hired 3 years before, and he was this superstar constitutional law, genius that they all love. So basically, I was being rejected by the same people we were socializing with, which was horrible. But remember, I told you that there's a silver lining to everything. So here's what happened. To get a teaching position, at least at Yale, you have to go through 2 stages. The first half is this screening interview, where you get interviewed by 8 members of this appointments committee. And only if you pass that do you get to give your paper to the whole faculty. So just preview, I flunked the first half, okay? But here's what happened. And this is a Harvard crowd, so you probably don't know, but Yale, there's a club called Maury's. It's dark. I have PTSD thinking about this interview. I was interviewed by 8 older white men, very nice, but it was a disaster from beginning to end. They kept asking me what my thesis was, and I was confused. I thought I'd already explained my thesis. And they kept asking me, what's your thesis? One of the things I had noticed when I was working down in Mexico is that all of the people we were working with, the elites, the government officials, the CEOs, the Mexican investment bankers, I noticed that they were all taller, lighter skinned with very European features. Whereas the vast majority of the Mexicans, the people doing all the menial labor, were shorter, darker, with more indigenous features. And I'd actually built this into my draft article. But at this interview, it was so awkward. I didn't know how to talk. I couldn't make it sound good. The rich people looked kind of white to me. And it was so bad that at a certain point I thought, I'm clearly getting rejected. I'm just going to get back on the train, go back. I was still at Cleary in New York. I'm just going to go back to New York and forget this. But here's what happened. Right before I left, a very famous legal historian, Professor John Langvine, who is still at Yale today, said, oh, I finally think I understand what you are interested in. What you're interested in, Amy, is the link between markets and ethnicity. And I was like, Yes. I had never thought of that. I thought I was writing about telephones, But as I thought about it, he was right. That was the phenomenon that I was zeroing in on. I never thought of it in such elegant, abstract terms. So anyway, I got rejected, fastest rejection ever, but silver lining. I got back to my New York apartment. The first thing I did is I pulled out my draft article and I added a subtitle. The article was now called The Privatization Nationalization Cycle, the link between markets and ethnicity in developing countries. And then I reworked it. It sounded so much more sophisticated, and I sent it out, and the Columbia Law Review took it. And that was a huge break. Now, back to the 100 rejections. Back to my original Tiger Dad. I remember telling my father in tears, I said, Dad, I know you always wanted me to be a professor, but it is not going to happen. Nobody wants me. And I will never forget my father's response. He said, wait a minute, let me try to understand this. You got 100 rejections and you want to give up? He thought that was a low number, right? I mean, remember, this is a guy that crossed an ocean to come to a country where he didn't know anybody. So for him, so I listened to him. I applied to a few more schools that hadn't yet rejected me, and I got one offer. The University of Buffalo Law School gave me an offer. I was ecstatic. To this day, I will always love Buffalo because they were the only ones to take a chance on me. I randomly root for all of their sports teams just because they were. So I was about to take that job, and we were going to commute, my husband at Yale, me at Buffalo, and at the last second, the Duke Law School, which had actually already rejected me, unrejected me. Very honestly, like, oh, somebody we liked better canceled on us. Do you want to come? And I always tell my students, it doesn't matter how ugly the process, all you need is one good offer. So that's how I became a law professor at Duke, which I loved. And at Duke, I continued to do my own weird little thing. Most people in the law, they write about constitutional law or criminal law. But I had a weird interest. I was very interested in the relationship between market and democratic reforms and ethnic conflict or religious conflict. That's what I was interested in. So I published a second article called Markets, Democracy, and Ethnicity, and the Yale Law Journal took that. And then I got incredibly lucky for a tragic reason. September 11th happened, the attacks on the World Trade Center. And suddenly, everybody was interested in exactly what I was writing about. When I first wrote this article, nobody cared about, the Middle East and Indonesia. But suddenly, I was the only person writing about the dangers of globalization, the dangers of rapid democratization in non-Western countries. So I turned that article into my first book that Dr. Haynes mentioned, World on Fire, How Exporting Free Market Democracy Breeds Ethnic Hatred and Global Instability. It became an instant New York Times bestseller. And in that book, I coined this term market-dominant minority, referring to these small minorities like the 1% Chinese, only 1% in the Philippines, who despite their tiny numbers control about 60 to 70% of the economy. Or in Indonesia, Chinese are 3%. It's not just the Chinese also throughout Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, but Indians, in East Africa, the Lebanese in West Africa, whites in South Africa. So I saw this phenomenon. And when my mother finally read this book, she said, wait, what? This is what you're writing about? The Chinese and everybody knows this. But she was wrong. Not everybody knew it. I knew it because of my outsider background, because my parents were these weird Chinese minorities in the Philippines, so I knew about the dangers of democratization in that context. So I'm always telling students, play to your comparative advantage. Anyway, that was in 2001, and that book, World on Fire, was selected by both The Guardian and The Economist as one of the best books of 2003. And 7 years after I was so humiliatingly rejected from Yale, they gave me a tenure-track offer. In 2011, I wrote another book. This is the infamous Tiger Mom memoir. That book is so misunderstood. Most people think I wrote it as some kind of a how-to guide. In fact, I wrote that book in a moment of crisis. So I have two daughters. One, the oldest, was a very easy kid. My second daughter was a total rebel. Basically said no from the beginning. Her whole life she said, I'm not going to college, I want to be a witch, and then she said, I want to be a garbage man. She refused to take standardized tests. She said she saw visions. And when she turned 13, those of you know what teenage adolescence is like. She rebelled, and I really thought I was going to lose her. I thought, oh my God, she hates me. And then I pulled back and I adjusted. So it was the day after this huge fight that I started writing that. And that book took me only 3 months to write the first 3/4 of that book. It just kind of poured out. My other books, I have writer's block. Like, I have to sit and stare at the computer for hours before I can write one sentence. My first book took me 7 years, but Tiger Mom book took me just 3 months. And that is actually the transition to this novel, because if you read the book, you realize that it's actually lots of little stories, 37 little stories. There are characters. My two daughters are the protagonists. They're actually the hero. There's a villain, me, and there's an arc and a crisis and a resolution. Anyway, that was easy for me to write. There was something natural about that. It wasn't research-based. And this brings me to this novel I just wrote, The Golden Gate. And all I will say, because I want to move to the next stage of our conversation, is that this was the most fun thing I've ever done, writing this. And part of the inspiration for this book, so this book, The Golden Gate, is set in the San Francisco Bay Area in 1944. Part of the inspiration for the book is that my parents are 87 years old, they still live in Berkeley, California. My parents currently live in Madame Chiang Kai-shek's former house in Berkeley. For reasons nobody knows, Madame Chiang Kai-shek lived in Berkeley, California by herself from 1943 to 44. Why would the First Lady of China be living by herself in Berkeley in the middle of the Second World War? At the time, there were rumors that she was having an affair with Wendell Willkie, a former presidential candidate. So I spun a whole story out of those facts. And the last thing I'll say is that, in a way, this was a time of Japanese internment. Asians, there were restrictions. Only white people could live up in the hills. And there was tremendous anti-Asian sentiment. Madame Chiang Kai-shek technically was not allowed to buy that house because there were racial restrictions on the deeds. Only white people. And it became such an embarrassment. Oh my God, the First Lady of China can't buy a house in America? That the president of Wells Fargo Bank in San Francisco quickly did an end run. So this book has also been a fun way for me to explore some of today's current issues. But above all, I wanted it to be a great Agatha Christie whodunit, and I will end with one final challenge. There's a great twist. The book opens with a grandmother from one of San Francisco's richest families being told that one of her 3 granddaughters is a murderer, but they don't know which one. And there's a big twist that I saw all the way to the end, and to this day, so far, no one has guessed the secret. No one has guessed the mystery. So with that, I think we'll move to our next stage, and thank you all very much for listening.